Create actionable intelligence. Connect the dots. Find the bad guys and dwarf financial crime. The FinTech revolution, it's all about moving financial transactions at the high speed of high-tech's most advanced networks and applications. But wait, not so fast. What about money laundering, fraud, terrorist financing, and other criminal activity? Greetings, everyone, and welcome from the Technology Association of Georgia. It's Tuesday, May 17th, 2016, and this is Tech Talk. I'm your host, Frank Baia. Up to the Tech Talk, proactively identify and monitor relationship risk by dissecting customer databases to identify the 6 degrees of separations that link seemingly unrelated entities. You could say, well, by thinking ahead of the risk. On this Search and Identify the Bad Guys discussion, we speak with industry top executive and visionary leader David Schiffer, founder and CEO of Safe Banking Software Solutions. David has directed his company's effort to combat money laundering, terrorist financing, fraud, and other criminal activity by providing anti-money laundering and compliance solutions to the financial industry and other corporations. A trusted advisor across the globe, he not only provides innovative solutions to clients, but he also shares practical knowledge and experience. He has met with the chief counsels and their investigative teams at both the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee and U.S. House Committee on Homeland Security. He's been interviewed by the media and is a frequent sponsor and speaker at associations of certified anti-money laundering specialists, conferences, and knowledge events. Tech Talk explores the FinTech phenomenon 6 degrees of separation and how the bad guys are out to separate the most sophisticated defenses from protecting FinTech transactions. As we Tech Talk with top industry executive and awarded recognized expert, CEO of Safe Banking Systems, David Schiffer. This edition of Tech Talk is brought to you by GlobalSpeak.com, new media consultants, corporate video and audio communications, video and audio production and distribution, live and virtual event production. Tag TV and Tag Radio is a service of GlobalSpeak.com, creatively delivering powerful marketing, video, and audio solutions. David, welcome to Tech Talk.
Thank you, Frank. It's great to be here.
You know, probably the hot topic of the day is security. We hear a lot about hacking and all of the problems of the defenses that are necessary to keep the bots out and all of the craziness that goes on in trying to keep the sanctity of information and data. And I don't think a lot of people realize that there's another issue, especially when it relates to FinTech and with the high speed of transactions. There's a lot of, let's just say, not necessarily good guys, maybe even bad guys that are playing around with the system. Let's talk a little bit about the perspective of just how it works when you're talking about something like, well, let's say, money laundering, for example.
Okay, sure. Well, you know that the banks and financial institutions are under really heavy regulatory scrutiny these days. The government has made them sort of their de facto enforcers. And there's a thing called KYC, Know Your Customer, and AML, Anti-Money Laundering. And so the banks and financial institutions have to know who they're dealing with. And for large institutions with tens of millions of customers, it's quite a difficult problem, and that's where we come in and help them.
Well, what does that mean, though? How do you help them exactly? How does that work?
Okay, so what we do is there are lists of, quote, bad guys. There are different types of lists. There are things called sanction lists, which are released by government agencies. In America, it's called the OFAC list. And in other countries, there are similar types of lists. And these are national security risks. These are the worst of the worst. These are drug kingpins, terrorists, and terrorist organizations. And banks and financial institutions and any American cannot do any business with anybody on a sanction list. Then there are other types of lists called PEP lists, politically exposed persons. And this came after 9/11 because it's felt that high-level senior political entities could have access to government funds for embezzlement and for terrorist financing. And then other types of lists for reputationally exposed persons, and those are fraudsters, money launderers, traffickers with, let's say, human traffickers, arms traffickers, drug traffickers, counterfeit traffickers, money launderers, fraudsters, scammers. So our job is to see if we can identify any of these people or organizations in our customer databases.
Yikes. I mean, it's pretty, again, when you first think about it, I think most people probably don't give it much thought. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, about hacking and just basic security, but we don't think about the activity that can go on. I'm assuming undetected, and what you're implying is that if it's not knowing isn't going to help you any. If you're an organization and you're dealing with these kind of transactions and they happen to happen, you're not aware of it, you're still responsible for it. So part of what you're doing is not only safeguarding the situation, you're protecting those individuals as far as some form of compliance or responsibility.
Well, absolutely, and it's not only in the transaction. So before 9/11, the requirements were just to look at payments and transactions for the sanctioned entities. After 9/11, it became a requirement to look at your customer database. So just as an example, let's say you have 10 million customers, you may only have 5,000 transactions a day. But the banks now are required to look at those 10 million customers and know if any of the people and organizations on these lists that I mentioned are in there. So it's quite a difficult problem. If you think of common names, this what we call entity resolution and collective entity resolution, which is comparing databases of names and addresses, is quite a difficult problem.
Well, I know one of the things that I've heard you speak about and written about is the whole concept of 6 degrees of separation. Go into a little bit about identifying necessarily what would be obvious links to various people that tie into some of the things that you're talking about as far as these databases are concerned.
Sure. So just to let you know, back in 2009, when my son was testing out some new methodology called collective entity resolution, which means not only just identifying two records if a customer and a record in the database are the same, but actually looking at multiple entities. And so he used the FAA database as a test, and he found several national security risks on there, including the Lockerbie bombers, McGrahi and FEMA, and a guy named Zavaius, who was drug kingpin and known as the drug kingpin of Peru. So in 2009, on the FAA list, and this was all made public, we had several articles in the New York Times and ABC News, Fernando Zavaius was a drug kingpin of Peru. He had an airline in Peru that the FAA revoked his airline's license, but didn't revoke his license. And we found he was linked to another fellow called Enrique Carnaval. Both had FAA licenses. And this is back in 2009. And subsequently, we found a Miami attorney, Stephen A. Freeman, who was his money launderer, living in Miami, a few blocks away from the ACAMS, which is the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists office. But we found him in 2010 in one institution. We found him in 2011 in another institution. And then we found in 2014, one of our customers had a fellow named Montesinos, who was Fujimori of Peru's spy master and Fujimori's son-in-law. And Fujimori was protecting Zavaius. So there are 5 guys linked over the last 5 years. And that has helped us tremendously in identifying this whole case.
Now, let's, I guess really, one of the things that we do with Tech Talk is we talk not just about a vertical as far as a particular segment of the technology. We end up going horizontally, not just vertically, because we talk to so many different internet security. I mentioned earlier about customer relationship management, on and on. Now it's Internet of Things. Right. Where I'm going is that one of the things that I think is really interesting is that when you're dealing with the kind of vertical that you're dealing with, one of the greater issues is we often say, do people actually know they have a problem, and do they know there's a solution for it? With the rapid change and so many things happening with technology today, how do you attract customers? Do you attract them by identifying most likely to be in a situation that you're describing, or do they come to you, or is it a little bit of both? I mean, how would they know that these kind of things are happening within their databases?
Well, they don't know they're in their databases, but in the case of banks and financial institutions, there are regulatory requirements. So the regulators come in every year and require the banks to show them their program, their compliance program. And for tech solutions, they have to even show them the model validation to prove that the model that they're using is valid, even in our case, because we have our whole solution is based on a model of 2 metrics of severity probability. Now, in the case of other companies like manufacturing companies or companies like, let's just say, Coca-Cola, who may have agents all over the world and vendors and a large number of entities that they may not know, and they may not have a requirement to know whether they have, quote, bad guys in their database, but they certainly should be looking at that. I can give you two examples. We did a proof of concept for an oil company, and we found a particular woman who was selling furniture to this oil company. When we showed them that information, they said, well, we don't buy furniture from an individual, and they had given us her name in the database, and it turned out that she was indicted for murder with her partner. They murdered her husband. And so, you know, Coca-Cola and other large corporations could also benefit by knowing who their customers are. Also, a few years ago, IKEA was fined by the government for buying rugs from Afghanistan. It turned out they were buying them from the Taliban, and so they got fined.
Well, you know, we talk about analytics and predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics and so many things as far as big data is concerned. Once again, I think this is an area where I'm sure a lot of our listeners are absolutely floored. I mean, it's not. I'm amazed. I'm not surprised, but the reality of the situation, as you're describing it, I'm going to get. Is it a competitive industry? Are you guys pretty much out there by yourselves doing this, or just how competitive is the market that you're in?
Well, it is competitive. There are a lot of large institutions that use other products, but we have a unique methodology. I didn't mention we have a patented methodology. When you go back to your 6 degrees of separation, we have a product called our Safe Exposure Index, which is based on Google's page ranking of ranking profiles of individuals to each other and to citations of where they are located, and also co-citation. So we look at these large databases as linked social graphs, and the other types of competitors two types of competitors. One are the software companies that we feel they really produce what we call alert factories, and they're working on a rules-based system, which we don't work on anymore. We use a principles-based system using those two metrics I mentioned, severity and probability. Other types of competition are the large consulting companies who offer a service similar to what we do, which is what was called a look-back service, as an example. So a regulator may come in and say, look back at all your customers and transactions from the years 2006 to 2009. And, you know, large institutions, that could be a large volume. So with our automation, we can do that in a few weeks, whereas large consulting companies have to hire several hundred people over the course of a year or two.
Now, is this a moving target? I mean, is it a case where pretty much it's the same thing, only different in terms of each one of the clients? I guess really where I'm headed now is how much is technological turnover impact your industry? How many things are changing, and do you or how do you keep up with the curve?
Well, certainly things are changing, and we've gone through about 4 or 5 different phases over our 15 years. We keep ahead of the curve in several different ways. One is we have a sister company. So Safe Banking Systems has a research think tank a lab called Bayard Rock. We have a few people in there. We have a PhD in mathematics. We have a machine learning guys, and we have to keep, of course, on top of technology. We have to maintain our customers' safety and sanctity with absolutely the latest in technology. So just to let you know, I mean, we say our main job is to keep customers off the front page of the Wall Street Journal, avoid regulatory fines, and avoid being summoned to appear in front of a congressional hearing that Senator Levin did a few years ago. He had some of the major institutions there and grilled them for hours about who was in their database, African dictators' sons, and things like that. So,
well, I'm thinking as you were talking also, one of the things you ought to mention is not buying furniture from convicted murderers. I mean, that would be...
I mean, you know, that was just sort of an anomaly. We hadn't seen that before because we haven't done that much with corporates yet, but as...
well, it just goes to show you what you don't know can hurt you, literally
Absolutely.
and figuratively. Well,
yes.
We're kind of quickly running out of time, but I know one of the things that I think a lot of our listeners are going to be curious to know about, and that is you guys are out of New York. You're a New York-based operation. How in the world did you come to open up an office in Canton, Georgia?
Well, a fellow I dealt with for 30 years who was a consultant of mine got relocated to Canton, Georgia. And so I started using him as a consultant a few years ago. And then about 2004 or 5, he became a full-time employee. And then as we started to grow, he hired a first programmer from Kennesaw University. Mm-hmm. And I think we have 4 or 5 Kennesaw State University graduates right now. And we've grown the office down in Georgia to about 15 people. That's our both software development and our operations office.
Well, David, one of the things that the Technology Association takes a lot of pride in, and it talks about where Georgia leads, and in so many verticals, I mentioned some of them before, but internet security certainly is one, but so many others, fintech. These are all areas where slowly, over an evolving period of time, our industries are clustering, they're growing, they're building and bringing in other expertise, other global headquarters, NCR, and some of the other companies, Porsche and others that I'm sure you're familiar, State Farm, and on and on. One of the great things about the building a global competitive technology industry is to have the kind of representation that's diversified enough to cover all of the aspects, and there are so many of them, but all of the aspects of what it takes to be involved in a digital global economy the way that we are. Certainly, without question, safe banking systems coming to Georgia and being part of the Georgia operation and doing the kind of things that you're doing, it's just one more indication of not just validating an image, but confirming an image as far as Georgia's where technology leads. So, David, thank you so much for, I think our listeners and I am overwhelmed by what you guys are into, the kind of jobs that you're doing, but also for taking time, I know, out of a very busy schedule to join us for a couple of minutes today on Tech Talk.
Oh, it was great. Nice talking to you. I was going to, closing mode, say we're not in Silicon Valley, but being down in Georgia, I'm in Silicon Peach. And happy to do that. So please, you can, any of the listeners, visit our website, safe-banking.com, or call us up, and we'll be happy to help you and give you any information about our company and our solution.